I'm Bill Amos, and welcome to another edition of And Now the News with Bill Amos. My guest today is Norman Spector, who will be known probably to many of our listeners because he was a longtime columnist with the Globe and Mail newspaper. But before that, he was a provincial civil servant here in British Columbia and a top aide to Premier Bill Bennett. After that, he was involved with provincial federal relations at the federal level, and he became the chief of staff for Prime Minister Brian Mulroney from 1990 to 93. And he was an ambassador for Canada to Israel, our first Jewish person who was a Canadian ambassador there. Is that not correct?
Yeah, it's about right.
So far I'm batting fairly high.
I was also the first representative to the Palestinian Authority, and that was just by accident. There was nobody else there, so I became the first representative to Arafat's authority.
Wow, quite a background, my friend. At any rate, lately, you have been very active on Twitter, opining on various subjects, including the way the pandemic has been held here in British Columbia. And a tweet you put out this week actually said that John Horgan owes his majority government to the fact that that government claimed to have done a magnificent job handling the first wave of the pandemic, thanks to the way reporters / cheerleaders had given him a bit of a free pass. I wonder if you'd like to expand on that opinion.
I'll put it this way. I think everyone was taken with the disparity in the data comparing British Columbia, which was perhaps the best, and Quebec the worst in the first wave. And while there are all kinds of caveats now about excess deaths and all that sort of thing that perhaps make us think twice about that comparison, there's no doubt that BC had far fewer deaths per capita than Quebec. And with that record, Bonnie Henry took a premature victory lap with getting an honorary degree from Royal Roads, where she talked about how we had gotten through the pandemic. And John Horgan broke his agreement with the Green Party and called an unnecessary election. I, by the way, was advising the Greens during those negotiations that resulted in the CASA. So it was pretty clear to me that he broke the CASA, and he soared to a majority government. And if you look at his approval ratings, the last poll I saw, he's tied as the most popular premier in Canada, together with Nova Scotia's premier, who was just elected recently. But if you look at the numbers, he was in the 30s through the first wave. And then as we came out of the first wave, he soared about 30 points to the 60s, where he is today. And that was all on the basis that we had done so much better than the rest of the country.
Supposedly.
Well, if you look at the latest genome sequencing studies, you'll see that British Columbia and Quebec got different viruses. It's ironic, with all the talk about China and even racism towards China, we were lucky to get the original strain from Wuhan that we started to get in January, and was the dominant strain here until the Vancouver Dental Conference in March. And that seeded the same strain that they got in Quebec, which was from Europe, and seeded New York, Boston, and Quebec, and areas to the east. And it was 1.5 times more infectious or transmissible than the variant we got. And if you look at the numbers in the first wave, you'll see that as those cases were seeded, the pandemic took off in British Columbia as well.
Yes.
But what happened with that is that when you look at the overall, when you look at the first wave, obviously the disparity between deaths in BC and deaths in Quebec was huge, but that disparity has continued right through the pandemic. Quebec closed the gap, but we're still relatively well off. But as each wave took place, the comparison between British Columbia and Quebec got much less favorable to British Columbia. So that was the first difference. Second difference is there was a huge mistake that came in the last week of February, where she missed a case that arrived from Iran that was totally unlinked to China. The person had not been to China. The person had not been in contact with anyone from China, and the person tested positive for COVID. The case came on February 20th. The only ones to write about this were one expose in the Globe and Mail in June that nobody picked up on, where every expert contacted by Robin Doolittle said that was the line in the sand when we should have known that we were talking about a pandemic, that the virus was no longer coming from China, it was racing around the world. It was on that basis that Australia, every state public health officer recommended to the Prime Minister that he declare a pandemic, which he did. In British Columbia, by contrast, you had the provincial government until March the 11th supporting the federal government, saying that border measures were useless, if not racist. And only on March 11th, after the Vancouver Dental Conference, did Horgan stamp his feet and demand that Trudeau protect the borders. So while the virus was inundating Quebec and Ontario from Europe, we were largely immune from it until the dental conference. Now, Bonnie Henry released one chart, I forget exactly the date, but it showed the progression of where the virus came from. And if you look at the curves, you see the curve from the original virus following the 0 point. And once the Vancouver Dental Conference was over, the curve went up at 45 degrees.
Wow.
So it was on that basis, and nobody in the media followed up on either the February 20th case or the dental conference seeding a different mutation, the first variant, as it were. Nobody followed up. And not only that, you then had journalists, in fact, contributing to the misunderstanding by comparing us to other jurisdictions and never comparing us to jurisdictions that were doing better. In fact, if you look at McElroy's data, the sample he was drawing excluded all kinds of jurisdictions that were doing better than British Columbia. And one of the big reasons they were doing better than British Columbia is that they faced Asia. They faced the Pacific. So we're talking about Vietnam or Japan or Korea or Australia or New Zealand. All those countries were doing better, and all their states were doing better than British Columbia. We were comparing ourselves to Quebec and Ontario and places that we were doing better than. So not only did journalists not ask why this had happened, they contributed to what I call a big lie that John Horgan then exploited in a very shrewd manner. I mean, that's what politicians do, to sail to a majority government.
And do you think that the BC government has continued this kind of strategy?
Absolutely. And it's been aided and abetted by journalists. And even this week, you read in the Vancouver Sun, in the line story in the Vancouver Sun and Province, how BC has done better than everybody else. So that hasn't changed a bit. That take on the pandemic has become endemic in British Columbia political analysis. And I think it's one of the factors that makes Bonnie Henry impregnable to criticism today. I mean, the reason you want to look and the reason for inquiries after each wave is to do better in the next one. There are lessons to be learned because let's face it, there's a lot they did not know at the beginning. There's a lot that governments learned over time. But by failing to look at the first wave and to ask the question, why is it that our death rates per capita were so low compared to other provinces in Canada, we in fact had a worse second wave than the first wave. Not only a worse second wave, but we had 4 times as many deaths in long-term care in the second wave. And you'll recall long-term care was one of the difficult areas in the first wave. And we were assured by Bonnie Henry and Adrian Dix that they had resolved the problem with the single site rule for workers in long-term care. Yet we had 4 times more death in long-term care in the second wave. And as the waves went on, we've been doing worse than the first wave and approaching how the rest of the country has been doing. So the virus is a being in itself. There's no magic in dealing with the virus. And it's the transmissibility of the virus that is the most important thing. And then the kinds of measures that you take to try to control it, mainly to ensure that the hospitals aren't overloaded.
Why do you think the BC media, no, it's not a blanket statement. There
are gradations.
There have been a few reporters, CTV's Penny Daphos for one, Charlie Smith of the Georgia Strait, Salim Jiwa, who is an independent reporter and tweets a lot about the virus. There have been a number who have been trying to hold the feet to the fire, so to speak, on the pandemic, but many of the reporters in the major outlets seem rather incurious, don't you think?
Well, I would argue that even the reporters who've been critical, and there have been, and more as we go along, and as people start looking at these frightening death numbers that are coming out in each wave, until and unless somebody bursts the lie of the first wave, the government and Bonnie Henry are impregnable to criticism, in my view. So it came late in the day. It never broke the myth that got established in the first wave, and that is still, in my view, the majority view in British Columbia. And so it's very difficult to bring about any accountability of the government. Now, you're right. Even at the beginning, there were some reporters, some journalists, who used the one question, one follow-up briefings, quote unquote, to ask some tough questions. And you could see how Bonnie Henry bristled when she was asked a tough question. And she still bristles, and she still refuses. She's been saying that we'll do our retrospective when it's over, yet the government and Adrian Dix promised a reckoning. That was his term for the long-term care deaths in the first wave. And yet we got the kind of inquiry that they announced this week that is looking into everything except the decisions that the government took on the economy and on health. So I would say that even the curious reporters, most of the curious reporters, came to their criticism too late to burst the myth bubble that had been established in this province.
What do you think the future holds for this approach to the pandemic as we go forward here?
Well, I think everybody's got their fingers crossed that we won't get another variant. And if we do, that it at least is not more severe and is not immune escape. And I think, in fairness to Bonnie Henry, I think she's got her head screwed on about needing to prepare for that. That while you can loosen now, you've got to keep your eyes open for what may come in the fall. Now, let's be frank about it. She tried this last summer. She assumed that hospitalizations and infections had been decoupled. And you remember Horgan held a press conference with her, and the exciting news that the Vancouver Sun headlined on its front page, and 2 or 3 weeks later, they had to withdraw because they were hit with a wave that was infectious and severe, and the hospitals were again threatened. So everybody now is sort of looking at the fact that this new subvariant is becoming dominant, which means it's more infectious. Hopefully it won't be more severe. Hopefully we'll get an increase in cases, but the hospitals will not be overrun. And we have to wait and see what happens in the fall.
Yes.
So, governments have learned from the previous waves, but they're obviously under a lot of pressure. I mean, a lot of the public are just fed up with all these restrictions.
I'd like to just change focus for a moment or two to talk to you about another subject that you've been paying a lot of attention to, and we all have, as a matter of fact, and that's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I know in the early days, you were saying you raised some doubts about how NATO had reacted initially. How did you feel about their first reaction?
Well, I was always looking down the road, as my training in government always taught me to look at the end and then work your way back in planning a strategy. And what struck me is that as soon as Putin was not deterred from invading, that it was going to become very difficult for governments to stand aside if it got very bloody, and if there were a huge number of refugees, and if there was great destruction. I thought it would be more difficult than it's proved to be. I think the public have basically accepted what governments are doing, and I don't really quarrel with that. I think that the prospect of a nuclear exchange is so serious that that is a reasonable judgment that NATO has made. Having said that, what concerns me now is that NATO seems to be willing to fight Putin to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. And in some ways, NATO has less of an interest in trying to resolve this by diplomatic means than Zelensky might have, since his people are the ones who are bleeding and becoming refugees, and it's his country that's being destroyed. So right now I see Biden and the other NATO leaders as feeling pretty good about the position they've got Putin in. I think they may be making a mistake in talking about war crimes and really backing him up against the wall, because at this point he has to double down and there's no telling what he might do, including chemical weapons and even tactical nuclear weapons. So I think it's quite dangerous. And I'm wondering how much longer Zelensky, who's been pleading for more help, is going to be willing to adhere to the NATO strategy of really sticking it to Putin as opposed to looking to some diplomatic resolution of the conflict.
Do you think that Putin is really serious about this nuclear threat? Because after all, if he actually did use a nuclear weapon, wouldn't that be the end for him?
Well, I think he's being put in the position of maybe thinking this is the end of him anyway. You know, when Biden starts calling him a war criminal, you're talking about taking him to The Hague, or you're talking about some kind of a popular insurrection in Russia. So you start putting Putin in the position of what does he have to lose personally? And, there's lots of escalation between where we are now and a real nuclear exchange. There's chemical weapons, there's biological weapons, and there are tactical battlefield weapons, which would not necessarily result in NATO responding in kind. I mean, it's clear that NATO is quite leery about getting into a full nuclear exchange. I mean, that's why they've allowed Putin to do what he's doing. Mm-hmm. You know, the last time we were in a conflict like this was the Cuban Missile Crisis. You're probably too young to remember that.
I do remember it, actually.
Were you under your desk too?
Yeah, I was under my desk in about grade 3.
Yeah, okay. So, if you look at the history of that, Kennedy was constantly looking for ways to give Khrushchev a ramp off, an exit strategy. And they patched up a face saver for both sides. We didn't learn about what the Americans had agreed to for some time. But anyway, that was resolved without a nuclear exchange.
Right.
It doesn't seem right now that NATO is eager to give Putin an off-ramp.
So how do you think that's going to end?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to watch Zelensky to see if he stays tight with he's been desperately pleading for more assistance. He's been getting a lot of assistance, but the killing and the destruction and the creation of refugees continues. So I think China is going to be interesting to watch. The Americans are letting China know that they don't want to see them intervene. But there's a real prospect that Biden here sees an opportunity not only to save his presidency, which has been floundering, but also to administer quite a blow to both Putin and Xi on the backs of Ukrainians.
Wow, it's going to be interesting over the next month or two, that's for sure.
I think it's going to continue for a while.
Well, with that, Mr. Spector, I'd like to thank you for being a guest on the podcast. Very insightful opinions from you, and wish you all the best.
Thank you for this opportunity. Have a great day.
You too, sir. Thanks. Bye-bye.